story? What matters in it to me? And then behind that is another question, which is, where do I feel moved by this? Where do I feel challenged by this? What's important? So that's the kind of first part of the process. And I need to start to see the film very quickly in my mind's eye. So I read the book many times, and I began to see some things that are very clear. First of all, it is a marvelous love story between Keir and James, between an Indian woman and a British man. And that is the emotional heart of the story. I was very moved by that these two people had found their way to each other from different worlds, and that they were intent upon creating together a new world, a new family. And I thought that was extremely touching, partly perhaps my own family. My father was Czech and my mother was English, and they found each other, and they made myself, my brother. So I had a sort of sense of what it might be like to try to invent a new relationship across worlds. I was also fascinated by the political intrigue which surrounds this romance and which pressurizes it enormously. It puts our two central characters under tremendous tension and tremendous pressure. And in fact, what happens is it makes them discover each other more, it makes them love each other more, it makes them realize what it is at the heart of their love that they're going to fight for. They're going to fight for their lives and for their love. And I found that also something I thought, this must be something that's at the heart of the story. And I found, of course, the ending of the story extraordinarily heartbreaking, that the father should die, that the mother should then suffer so much, that she should then die, and that the children should not know their parents. It's like a late Shakespeare play. They have lost everything of the world that they came from. And what is so marvelous in the book is that in the end there is a way in which Kitty, the daughter, is able to connect back to what she has lost. What she has lost is found, and I found that to be a very moving thing as well, and I wanted to make sure that if the audience cries in the film, that that's the moment where they cry. The other thing that I thought was marvelous about the book that I wanted to make sure was very present was the optimism of the way people were living together at this time. The British were coming to India, they were finding it marvelous. All these young men, 14, 15, 16, were coming from England, boring, dark, rainy, wintry England, class system, tremendous problems. And they were finding in India a really wonderful, remarkable, open world in which they could reinvent themselves in a way that was far beyond any opportunity they might have had in their own country. So there's something in this story about the meeting of worlds, but there's something also in this story about how people can reimagine themselves and transform themselves by the encounter with another world. And I think that happened both ways. It happened certainly to James, but I think it also happened to Keir. So I read and I thought, and I read and I thought, and at a certain point, all of this reading and writing comes down to the nitty-gritty, which is you have to start writing, which, as any writer knows, is the worst moment of every project. The 120 white pages await you, and how are you going to cover them with anything that has any dignity or any humor or any emotion and drama? I like to work through character. I think stories are about people. This is a story about people. And so I thought very much about James and Keir in particular. And what I liked about James, most of all, he's incredibly well equipped as a young man to make the most of the position he finds himself in. He's very handsome, he's fluent in many languages, he's charming, he has a gift for intrigue. All of those things give him professional status. But what's most alive in him, I think, and something I wanted to connect to with the character, is I think he has a tremendous appetite for the experience of being alive. So he goes from a rigid country to a country where he has the opportunity to feel more alive to himself and to the world in which he finds himself. I think beyond that is a sense that he's able to transform. He's able to go from this kind of man to a man who wears these clothes and eats this kind of food and speaks these languages. And that is a fundamental, dramatic gift for any writer. But beyond that, also, James finds himself caught in a tremendously complicated trap of very, very high stakes. And he finds himself genuinely conflicted for much of the story between his loyalty to England and his loyalty to the East India Company and the world that he came from, and then his loyalty and his sympathies, which are evolving very, very rapidly, partly from his own nature, but partly also from the relationship itself, from the love story itself, is opening him up to deeper and deeper sympathy with a world that he already knows, but is giving him greater and greater insight. And so as history starts to change throughout this story, and what had been a mercantile interest for the East India Company starts to become political domination, he becomes less and less happy with that, and therefore in a position of having to ask himself, what do I think, what do I feel, and where are my absolute true loyalties? So I wanted to make sure that in what screenwriting journals call the arc of that story was very, very strongly there. I'm not sure about all this language about arcs and so on, but it is quite useful to talk about. Of course, the other marvelous character in this story is Kea herself. And there are two sides to every love story, and it seemed to me absolutely vital that this film should tell both sides of that love story. But it is harder with Kea because she has dissolved quite a lot more into the lost history of her experience. And it seemed to me, as I tried to research what her life might have been like on a day-to-day basis, there's actually very little research, there's very little information. There is some, and I was tremendously grateful to that. But one of the great challenges for me was to find out much more about what her life was like, what her choices might have been, why did she choose this Englishman over someone of her own world, and what kind of audacity, what kind of bravery was involved in that. And I still struggle with this. It's a new territory for me, but I was very fortunate yesterday to have a marvelous conversation with someone who grew up in Hyderabadi Zanana, and that was an absolute revelation for me. I was tremendously grateful for that. So I can tell you, since I finished the draft, I now know a lot more than I did about eating and about sleeping and about bathing and all of those things that actually make up the experience of life on a day-to-day basis. It does matter to me tremendously that I honor Kea, and also that I make her story as authentic and truthful as possible, and that both sides of the story are involved in the film. The political intrigue as well brings forward what every film must have, which is a tremendous antagonist, a wonderful baddie. And the British, of course, thought that Aristujar was the great antagonist of this story. And I, like James, didn't really think so. I thought he's a tremendous Machiavellian, which is a marvelous thing for a drama. He is quite prepared to trap James in a very delicate situation, to use a situation of love and of pregnancy to his own advantage. But it seemed to me that he was doing all of those things because of one thing, which was his love for his world and his wish to protect that world from the increasing violent aggression of the British in India. So I find Aristujar a wonderful character. He starts as a baddie, and in the course of the story, he becomes almost a father to James. He begins by betraying him, and in the end, they become as close as it's possible to be. And to me, the absolute baddie of this story is, of course, Wellesley himself, who came to India with an ambition which had nothing to do with India and everything to do with his own personal vanity and everything to do with his own wish to establish a political dominance over India, which had no respect whatsoever for India itself, or the fact that everything that he was taking from this country was going to make wealth in another place. So he is my absolute villain in this story. Anyway, so much for the big ideas of all of this. The nitty-gritty is that as a screenwriter, we only have a limited amount of space in which to tell our story. Here is a book which is 700 pages long. It's very digressive, it's encyclopedic. I have 120 pages. I have 3 acts, or actually in this case I have 5 acts, to tell my story. And I would like to be able to tell you that I, like an architect, went forth and I planned the story and I worked out how everything was going to happen, and I had marvelous diagrams on the wall and I knew where this was going to happen and where this was going to happen. And I'm afraid none of that is true. I always proceed from not knowing what I'm doing, And I know that in film that's not necessarily the way people work because film, after all, is an industry as well as an art. But for me, I can only write it and I can only value it if it seems to me to come from a place inside myself which would be the same as if I was writing a poem. So it has to be an act of imagination. So I only very gradually discovered the shape of the story. And I think I did that by asking myself over and over and over again, what is the story? What is this really about? What do we care about in this story? And so I'm not someone who can write a sketch of the story. I like to be able to finish a scene and then move on to the next scene. It's like painting something into reality. It's like painting an enormous painting. And I don't feel happy until I can move forward. But the truth is, the experience of writing it is that as you begin every day, you're faced with many, many possibilities. It's like a labyrinth of possible stories that you could develop from each scene as each scene goes forward. So there was a tremendous amount of writing and then tearing things up and then scratching things out and beating my head against the wall and thinking, I'm rubbish, I can't do this. Most of the time it felt like that. But gradually as you work, the thing starts to develop almost like a large photograph. It comes out of pieces and it starts to hold itself together in all sorts of ways. And I remember coming to the end of the first draft and feeling tremendously pleased with myself that I had found a complete shape for the story. But of course, there was an enormous amount of work to do, and I've just finished the second draft, which Willie is now reading. I have to see what he thinks about that later. And that took me 6 months, pretty much of non-stop work. I also think that film as a medium proceeds by juxtaposing scene by scene. What you have as a screenwriter is, as your unit of work, is the scene, where the scene begins, what happens in the scene, and where it ends. And one of the things that screenwriters are taught is that you must start the scene as late as possible, and you must finish the scene as early as possible. But of course, as you write, you edit yourself, and you discover what the scenes must be. But the other crucial thing in a film is that it's the juxtaposition of one scene against another. And that really is where the emotional life of the film starts to take place. There's a great filmmaker called Anthony Minghella. I don't know if you know his work, but he said a film gets written 3 times. It gets written in the script, it then gets written in production and performance, and then it gets written again in the editing, which of course is marvelous for a director to say, but for a writer, what you want is to write something which is absolutely as strong as you can make it. I should also talk a little bit about dialogue, because I think the idea is that film writers write dialogue. And of course, dialogue is very important. Hitchcock said that dialogue is just another sound, but it's coming out of a character's mouth. And actually, I don't agree with him. I think dialogue is about all kinds of things. It's about what's said and what's not said, and what's accidentally said, and what about silences. But the scene itself doesn't depend on the dialogue. The dialogue floats above what's actually going on between the characters. In the end, writing a film is about structure. It is about deciding what the story of the film is over and over and over again, and how that story moves forward. I found the hardest thing in this was to condense down the political intrigue around the relationship. And the other hard thing was to write Kaya's story, and I'm still working on that. But the other thing about the story, unusually, is that it's not a story that ends at the end of the story. If you were writing the story as fiction, you would not have James die, as he does in real life. You would have him live on. So I had to find a way for the story to end, but not in the story of James and Care. It has to end with Kitty. So I now have a framing story which begins with Kitty, at the very beginning being invited to come and visit someone who has something that he wants to tell her. And at the end, she discovers both the painting and the letter. And the reason those things are so important for me, I think, is both that it's in the story, but it's also my personal experience with this, because I was lucky enough to meet the descendants of James and Care, and they showed me the miniatures, and they showed me the letters. And above all, they showed me a brocade bag which contained a scroll. And I opened the scroll, and gold dust fell onto my hands. And this was the letter that Kitty's lost grandmother wrote to her when they were finally connected back together again 35 years later. And that is the kind of moment as a writer that absolutely makes you alert and awake to the fact that you're writing about real lives and about real destinies. And the other thing that also was very important was I saw the Chinnery portrait of the two children, and I'd seen reproductions of it, and I imagined it was quite small. But when I actually saw it, it was life-size. And I realized that it was painted because it was the only thing that Care was going to be able to keep of her children when they were sent back to England. And so that portrait became a kind of mirror of her loss. And in fact, it is both the first image in the film and the last image in the film. And I hope that's what will give the film both heartbreak but also some kind of solace. Anyway, I shall stop there, and thank you very much. Thank you.
Can we put up the picture of the Chinnery portrait again, from the PowerPoint, the slide one from the end, just to, so we can see the image we were talking about. Nick, just to kind of open the discussion, could you say a little about where the project is in terms of production?
I can say that we have a draft that we're happy with. I'm going to talk to Willie about that afterwards. But Ralph Fiennes, the English actor who now is also a very fine director, will direct the film. And as I understand it, there's hope that it could be made at the end of next year or early 2015.
And the producer is a guy called Frank Dolger. I don't know if there's are there any Game of Thrones fans in the audience? But yeah, so I don't think we're going to get wildlings coming into the White Moghuls, but
yes.
it's the same producer as Game of Thrones. So he's got a good commercial sense, I think.
He has, yes.
I've just read the script today, and I'd read an earlier draft a year ago. And I have to say, I was completely